Welcome to Book Time with Ryan. I am somebody. You don't know who I am because I'm wearing this helmet. Well, I'll help you out. Oh, it's ripping on my nose. I'm Ryan from Book Time with Ryan. Oh, this is not very comfortable. It's not. It doesn't fit like I thought it would, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Oh, but I can't lift it too far. It cuts into my nose. All right, we're gonna try this. We're gonna try it. I swear that looked like a motorcycle, like a race car driver. And it's like messing with my mustache. Okay. Well, today I'm talking about Neal Stephenson's Seveneves. Seveneves. This is a long book. This is 867 pages. 867 pages. It's a long book. I have been a little slow with my reading, maybe not with my reading, but with my output of content, because it's long. This is a long book. I think out of my last maybe 10 books, like 2 of them have been over 1,000 pages. This one's almost 900 pages. So it takes a little bit of time. I really like this book. I've had this book for a while, and I finally decided to pick it up because I was looking for a nonfiction book to read. I'm sorry. I was looking for a fictional book to read, and this one just spoke to me. This is really not comfortable. Should I take it off? I might have to, because this is going to mess up my nose. All right. Well, I'm still kind of dressed for it because I've got my U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Space Force, super limited edition Water on Mars, Send in the Coast Guard shirt. Coast Guard, Space Force. All right. So, and only one of those is a real Guardian. You heard it here. I'm using my computer today because there's a lot of things that happen in this book, and I got to a point where I was just kind of seeing the names and recognizing the character without really reading the names anymore. And that's not great for a review. There are going to be a lot of spoilers, so prepare yourself. This book kind of happens in, I would say, 3 parts. And I think it sets it up for a sequel, at least one sequel. You have parts 1, before I start with that. Something's going to happen. Oh, I already said there's going to be a spoiler. All right, so this is really an apocalyptic book, kind of. And it starts with, we're meeting some of the characters, and you'll find out who these characters are. Some of them are on Earth, some are on the International Space Station. But they're just kind of doing their thing. And one of them is kind of observing the moon, or some people are observing the moon, I guess. And something happens. And there's a big cloud around the moon, and they realize that the moon has been split up into 7 parts, eventually 8 parts. They don't know what happened, and we don't actually find out exactly what happened, definitive proof of what happened, but the theory is that a tiny black hole flew through the moon and split it up. Could have been other things? Yes, it could have been. Do we ever find out? No. I thought we might. But as I got closer to the end, I was like, I'm probably going to leave that one hanging. So you have the moon split up, and that scares a lot of people. But the moon pieces, they were like, they're just going to come back together pretty much because of gravity. They're basically, they're in the same movement around Earth. They're in the same orbit. They're just a little bit further apart, and maybe they'll come back together. But we find out pretty quickly that it's not going to be pretty. Not only are the pieces going to eventually kind of come together, but they're going to crash into each other and break off little pieces. And those little pieces are going to break off and make little pieces that are breaking off. And eventually, the gravity is going to pick them up, and it's going to enter the Earth's atmosphere. And it's going to create something called the hard rain, which is going to destroy the planet Earth and kill everything on it. So that's bad. That's pretty bad. Remember, this is fiction. So you have people in the space station. Well, they're going to stay there. And then you have this push to somehow create a way for the human race to go on, and then hopefully reseed the earth and rebuild. Well, how long is the hard rain going to be? It's been raining around here for a couple days. Maybe it won't be that long. Well, it will. It will be thousands of years. So they're not only they're going to have to get off Earth and have everything they could possibly have to repopulate it, they're going to have to find a way to live off Earth for probably 5,000 years. That's a long time. Just a little bit longer than the US has been around. And think about the changes between revolutionary times and someone saying like, that's not true. That's been around a lot less than 5,000. I know that. I know. But think about the differences between 1500 and 2000. Whew. That's a long time. There's a lot of change that happens in there. And that's without the entire planet being basically destroyed. The Earth's still there, but the planet, the surface has really burned off. So all the countries in the world kind of combine their efforts to create some kind of plan. The problem is they have this thing called bolides and comets, meteorites, whatever, things floating in space that if they hit one of the vehicles that they're trying to plan, kind of like an arc, well, it could kill everything on it. It's a big threat even now with the space station and shuttle. If you've ever seen the movie Gravity, the beginning of that movie is such an intense scene because it has all these little collisions that create, I think it's called the Kessler effect or the Kessler reaction or whatever, but it is exponential, and every little piece creates a million more pieces that create a million more. It's just exponential explosions, collisions. Watch that movie you haven't. I saw it in IMAX in a theater and I was holding my breath. That entire scene was the most intense scene I think I've ever seen in a movie in my life. So that's the threat, is like if you have all of humanity in one spacecraft and that gets hit, well, you've just lost all humanity. So the idea they have is they're going to have swarm. They're going to have a lot of smaller pods that are going to house 5 or 10 people, and they can be combined into groups. And that way, if something's coming and they can track it, they can move out of the way a lot easier. If something's hit, well, it only affects a small part of the population, because right now, while we don't want people to die, it's really about preservation of the species. And that's where we are with that, right? So they're found a way to pick people to represent different races, different countries, different societies or cultures, and the idea is that they're going to be put up in space. But some people figure out that it's really not going to work out like that because they can't do it fast enough, and really you can't just randomly trust the fate of a species on randomly selected people. So some of them will train, but some of them won't be able to go up in the end. There's just not enough time and not enough space. The book is basically in 3 parts. The first part is that pre-zero day. Zero is the impact, a thing they call the agent, but we never find out what the agent is, the thing that hits the moon. So part 1 is leading up to that. That's part 1. Leading up to that, and then part 2, so they know that this stuff's going to happen, but it's not going to happen immediately. They're thinking like 2 years. So part 1 is before the collision and then leading up to, before the collision. And you get to see a lot of development of the space station, what kind of technologies they're considering, the politics behind it. And you're really focused on some stuff that's happening on Earth, but especially focused on the people on the International Space Station and how they're preparing. Part 2 is 2 years later, when the actual hard rain event is going to happen. So they've been preparing, there have been advances, changes on the space station, changes with people. There have been deaths because it's a pretty tough environment anyway, and the way they're working to get things built is pretty risky. So people do die. Some people die of exposure to radiation and cosmic rays. It's a rough environment. The other thing that happened is there's a lot of this kind of backstory on like meteor mining meteorites, and the space station has a piece called, I forgot the name of the pieces, but it's on the front of it's on one of the ends basically of the International Space Station. And it's really, not only are they mining it and kind of investigating, how to deal with it and what to do with robots on this piece of iron, but it also acts kind of as a shield from incoming bolides, incoming space matter that could destroy the space station. The space station is kind of huddled behind the lee of that big meteor. Is it meteor or asteroid? Meteor. All right, so we have a crew, and it dwindles down. Oh, okay. So that part one. Part two is, just before hard rain begins, and there's also this kind of side story of they're trying to find this asteroid to mine or get the water to use as propellant, because they figure out that they're not going to have enough propellant with the space station to live. It's kind of the idea is that they're not going to live, but leaders of the world are trying to find a way to make people hopeful so they don't lose it. I mean, so they're pushing for something. People are hopeful, but the reality is it's probably not going to work. So part two is really right before it all begins, right before the hard rain, and a lot of the movements of the space station and the new developed one called the Endurance, which is just the space station kind of reconfigured with this asteroid that they collect. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to get out of this decaying orbit around Earth, where they're also kind of in line for a lot of the rocks coming off of the collisions from the moon. And they want to go to, I think, a piece of the moon called the Cleft. I think it was a piece of the moon. It was one of the broken big pieces, and find a spot there where they can kind of settle down, be protected from cosmic rays, from collisions mostly. So how do they get there? Well, this is not just 3D movement, it's also different orbits and having to calculate for that. There's a lot of calculations here. It's pretty complex. And in the middle of all this, part of the group of survivors, now it's kind of, you have these arklets, these little pods that the population that was selected from Earth, they're living in, and there's some limitation of movement. And then you have the people that are on the space station that really kind of prepared all this and are some of the experts, and there becomes a division between the two. And that just gets worse and worse. And eventually, the president of the United States, now all that is away, right? Everything's been burned up. And there was a treaty and there was a constitution for the space group that was created by all the countries before they were destroyed. And one of the treaties was that world leaders are not qualified to go up to the space station. They can't save themselves. Well, the U.S. President Julia Bliss Flaherty somehow made it up, and she kind of leads this revolt in the arklets, the little pods, and basically it's like, people on the space station, they don't represent our concerns, they are using us as pawns, blah, 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 blah. Real politics. She's not an expert in anything. So eventually they have this kind of rebellion, and some of the arklets leave. The swarm, they call it the swarm. The swarm leaves, and then even part of that swarm has an expedition to Mars. And that's kind of the swarm is there to wait for good news from Mars so that they can all travel to Mars too. And the experts on the space station are like, that's not going to work. You're never going to make it. It's a death sentence. But the politicians who are not experts push for it anyway. And eventually, at the end of part 2, the Endurance gets to the cleft and settles in. There's a lot of stuff that happens in between here, but they settle in, and that's it. And then we go 5,000 years in advance. And, oh, I'm sorry. What happens is a lot of people die, right? So out of thousands of people that started out in this mission, there end up being 8. And it's all women. The men came down with radiation poisoning. They had cancers, accidents. They were exposed more, and they kind of, because the idea is that they're going to reproduce, women are more important, because you could have one male impregnating multiple women, but you can't have multiple women impregnating one male. That doesn't really work, right? You need to have more women. Men just didn't work out in space. I'm sorry to say. That sucks. I know. I'm a male. Why? So there were 8 women, including people from the swarm. The swarm basically died off. They resorted to cannibalism, and 2 of the people came back from the swarm and survived. So you end up having a total of 8 people make it to the cleft. 7 of them are fertile women who can reproduce. One of them is older. She's through menopause. She's not going to reproduce, probably. She won't. And these are the Seveneves. I thought the Seveneves were going to be the names of... We're pulling the names from the pieces of the moon, since it broke up into 7 pieces. But no. The Seveneves are these 7 women. And they have all this genetic information. And they have a geneticist on board who can basically impregnate them with past information. And they find out, like, this is the future of humanity. And really, when you're down to 8 people, 7 people that reproduce, all females, in an environment that's very risky, there's a good chance that you won't make it. They know that. They're like, this is our chance to, make a new population, reproduce as many times as possible. But also, since you're going in there and messing with the genetics anyway, and trying to correct some of the mutations that could cause different diseases or disabilities known in the remaining women, why don't you go in there and change other stuff? And they basically, the geneticist says that if the women want to change something, they can. It's going to be between that woman and the geneticist. I don't know if she's really a geneticist. She's whatever. That's her expertise. A lot of them, pick certain things that they want to highlight. And that 5,000 year jump that we make is after all that happens. And we're basically in a new society that has survived. There's billions of people. They live mostly off Earth because we're done with the hard rain. There's a lot of, they expanded from the cleft. There are basically 7 races now. The 7 races, and there's sub-races, but the 7 races track their beginnings from their Eves. So they identify as an Eve, like they're founding Eve. And they have characteristics that are based off of the Eves. There is some overlap sometimes, but they also kind of congregate with their own kind. And there are some natural synergies between the different Eves that we saw on Space Station that carries over to the species that they created of humans. Now they're still humans, but they have like different characteristics, and it's been kind of reinforced over the years. So you have these rings and settlements in orbit around Earth. Earth is coming back around. The hard rain is ended. There's a process to terraform, basically terraform Earth, replant, repopulate it with the information that they have from the genetics of dead animals that were digitized, plants and animals. They throw a lot of asteroids to introduce water, restart kind of adding water back to the oceans. This is a long process. Although 5,000 years does not seem like that long. It does to me as a person who's not going to live to 1,000, obviously. But in the grand scheme of things with evolution, 5,000 years is less than a blink of an eye. It's a tiny bit of time. And I don't feel like there would have been such great change, and I don't know how they would have sped it up if there was. I don't, that's one of the things I was like, I don't know. Especially some of the changes that happened with the races, because you have the 7 races in space, but then, and there's a split between the 2 women that came from the swarm, Julia, the president, the Julians, and I think her name's Ida, and they're called Idans. She's the one that kind of led the rebellion against the president and then tried to take over the space station. She's bad. They're both not likable characters. Their populations in the future, 5,000 years in the future, are split too. Basically, everyone from the space station is considered blue, and then these 2 populations that came off of these 2 women, they're in the red, and they're warring. They have little battles, especially once they're able to start trying to repopulate or at least visit Earth. When they get there, members of the main group that we're seeing in part 3 saw somebody on the land. It could have been the Sooners, the people from space that went back illegally and tried to settle, but something's off. So they send a group down, a delegation representing each of the races, and they find other survivors. You had the people that left and went to space. Eventually they're called spacers, I think. And then you had people that dug in and lived underground, they're called diggers at the end of this, but they're actually kind of led by the father of one of the people at the space station, Dina. The group of people, the 7-person delegation that goes down to meet with them, it does not go great. And one of their members is killed by one of the diggers, and it's like, oh shit. And it turns out one of the group members is actually a traitor, a mole, working for the red group, and she takes one of the diggers with her, and they go back up. They come back, and they have a treaty between the Reds and the diggers, and it turns out that there's another group. The Pingers. The Pingers are people who were a part of another program, not just the space program. There were multiple things happening here. Basically a program that went to the trenches in the ocean and tried to build settlements there so humanity could survive that way if the space stuff didn't work or the digging didn't work, because a lot of the oceans burned off, but some of the deepest parts still had their water. So you also had these Pingers, and they are humans that have developed almost like whale-like qualities, like their skin and just the way they look and stuff. So the Pingers end up siding with the blue people, and the diggers are kind of siding with the red. And that's kind of where it's left. Is this going to develop into a bigger war? Well, maybe. The Pingers really kind of rule the waters, which is most of the Earth, and the diggers are claiming the land. The Reds are probably tricking the diggers, and the Pingers are, I don't know if they're vulnerable. We haven't really seen a lot of them yet. It's really just at the end that we see them. And it's kind of left just with some of the people that were left from that delegation, all blues, sitting around with one of the diggers who is smart and is young and likes one of the people that were living on the ground that was kind of like a guide for this group. This boy named Einstein. It just kind of leaves with them being together. And it's clear there's going to be more conflict between the diggers and the Pingers, between the Reds and the Blues. But we don't get to that. And we never find out about Mars. Mars. So we don't know, like, if that mission succeeded. I would guess that this is set up nicely for a sequel, at least one book sequel that either talks about, I wouldn't be surprised if it's about the diggers and the Pingers and kind of moving forward, this 5,000 year point. And then what happens with the Martians, the group that went to Mars from the swarm. I like this book. I gave it 5 stars, but there are slow points in it. It's very descriptive. If you've watched my channel more than this video, I read a lot of dry stuff. So I'm comfortable with descriptive, dry stuff. If you're looking for nonstop action, you're going to find some slow points, but very descriptive. And I think in a lot of ways, at least the parts that I knew about, fairly accurate. There's a lot that I don't know about. But it was really good, and then it picked up. The only things that I wasn't sure about was just the time frame, and I'm not sure if we would. There's a lot of things that go wrong, especially with only 8 people left, and 2 of them you don't trust, in really dangerous space. Not only is there a lot that can go wrong with just those 8 remaining people, but even the years ahead and how many things can happen that could wipe them out. 8, 10, 20, 30, 100, not a lot of people to repopulate billions of people from a planet, but it worked in the book. And I think if they come out with, if Neal Stephenson comes out with another book that's related to Seveneves, I'll definitely read it, because it was good. It was fun. And it was, it's 860 something, 880 something pages long, but I read it pretty quick, especially if you've seen how slowly I read some of these other books recently. It was a page turner. There were definitely moments where you're like, what's going to happen? I got to keep reading. Don't worry about sleep. I'm going to read and read and read. And that happened, but it was worth it. I'm reading a much shorter book now. There's going to be probably some shorter books in the near future. I do have a couple long books left, but I do want to read some quicker stuff too here. And that's it. So thanks for being here today. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for sticking around, even though I haven't done a lot of videos in the last month or 2. I think it's going to pick up a little bit. All right. Have a good one. Bye. And